In this video, we'll be going through all the shooting modes available on the Insta360 X4. Before we get into it, remember that you can order your X4 from 180by2.co.za and please subscribe so you can get notifications for future videos about 360 cameras and VR gear. Let's get right into it, starting with 360 Photo mode. This mode lets you take a 360 image with a resolution of 18 megapixels or 72 megapixels. You can use a countdown timer and also change the format to either INSP, PureShot and PureShot Plus RAW. That will also save the original uncompressed file. Just note that RAW images take up a lot more space on your memory card. Going through the exposure settings, when you're in auto exposure, you can tweak exposure compensation. That'll make your image brighter or darker. Then white balance, which has its own switch for manual and auto, so you can set that value or let the camera figure it out for you. And balanced exposure, that'll help when the lenses have to deal with different lighting conditions. So with this example, standing in the doorway, where one lens is facing the sunlight from outside and the other facing the dark shadows from inside, balanced exposure will help to, well, balance the exposure. Of course, you can adjust all of these manually, but what's really cool is you have automatic controls in manual mode too. So you can set your own manual ISO and still have your shutter speed and white balance adjust automatically. Then all your manual exposure settings can be seen on the screen. The next mode is 360 video. Here you have the option of shooting in 4K with up to 100 frames per second, which is great for slow motion footage. Then 5.7K up to 60 frames per second, which is also recommended when shooting in low light scenarios. After that, 5.7K plus up to 30 frames per second. This boosts the image quality to look more like 8K, but doesn't take up as much space and also doesn't cause the camera to heat up as fast as shooting in 8K. And of course, there's 8K at 30 frames per second, which gives you the highest resolution 360 video with more quality when reframing. The exposure settings can be adjusted similarly to photo mode, with the addition of low light stabilization that'll boost the smoothness of your footage for darker shots. And you get 3 color profiles, namely standard, vivid and flat. HDR video is pretty much like the normal video mode, but you can only shoot in 5.7K at 30 frames per second. And as for exposure settings, you can only adjust your white balance because this mode does all the work of balancing your colors and lighting for you. HDR Photo works in the same way, but for still images. Again, you can use 18 or 72 megapixels in PureShot format and can only change the white balance in the exposure settings. Then there's Timelapse. This can help you turn a very long shoot into a short sped up video. You can shoot in 5.7K at 30 frames per second, with the lowest interval being half a second and the highest interval being 2 minutes. Then 8K with the minimum interval being 2 seconds and an amazing 11K with the same interval settings. So for example, if we shoot at 11K with the 5-second interval at 30 frames per second, the camera will take an image every 5 seconds, then play those back in sequence to create your time-lapse video. Now, it's best to use time-lapse in cases where the camera will be still, like being on a tripod, but if you'd like to add motion to your video, you can use Timeshift. Similar to time-lapse, this will give you sped up footage but also works well for shots where the camera is moving. You can decide to shoot in either 5.7K or 8K with 30 frames per second, and you can also change the rate of speed that your video will use. Bullet time. Bullet time is basically a slow motion video that points the view to the bottom of the camera. You can shoot in 5.7K at 120 frames per second or 3K at 240 frames per second for even slower motion. And you don't get the full range of manual exposure settings, but you can adjust your color profile, exposure compensation and white balance. Loop recording. Loop recording, or in other words, dashcam mode, lets you record continuously without filling up the space on your memory card. So by setting the loop duration, for example, a 1-minute loop duration will mean that the camera will only save the last 1 minute of the video once you've stopped recording. Next up is Starlapse. This lets you take a high exposure Starlapse video or star trails photo that'll show the movements of stars at night. This only shoots at 18 megapixels and you can change the duration of the recording and set a startup timer. On auto exposure, you can adjust the exposure compensation, white balance and balanced exposure, and manual exposure lets you change the shutter speed and ISO as well. Burst photo. This lets you rapidly capture pictures with a resolution of 18 megapixels. You can set the burst duration and number of images to capture, so setting it to 15/1 means the camera will take 15 images in 1 second, and 15/10 will capture 15 images over 10 seconds. You get the same exposure options as the normal photo mode, including changing the format to INSP and PureShot, but RAW isn't available with Burst Photo due to their large file sizes, which would take forever to save. Then there's Interval. This is almost like Burst Photo, but the difference is that you can set a longer interval between each picture being captured. Interval also gives you the option of shooting in 72 megapixels, and you can set a duration that tells the camera to keep taking images for that amount of time. So if I set the duration to 3 minutes with an interval of 3 seconds, the camera will snap a pic every 3 seconds and will stop capturing after 3 minutes has passed. Exposure settings are the same as burst mode, but here we do have the option to save raw images since the camera has more time in between each capture to save those large files. Now let's go through the single lens modes. These let you use one lens at a time, just like a normal camera. With single lens photo, you can shoot with a resolution of 9 megapixels or 36 megapixels, and also change your aspect ratio from 16:9 landscape to portrait or square. You can change which lens you're using by pressing the circle arrow on screen, and also adjust your field of view between ultra wide and D-warp, which is basically a flat video with less distortion around the edges. Exposure settings remain the same as 360 photo, with the addition of changing your metering mode from face priority, which will improve the exposure on faces for portrait shots, or matrix, which balances exposure for the entire image. Single lens video lets you shoot in 1080p, 2.7K and 4K at 60 frames per second. You can shoot in landscape or portrait, and you get another field of view option called Action, which emphasizes the fish eye effect to give you a more immersive video. Free frame video. This mode allows you to shoot first, then decide on the aspect ratio you'd like to use later on in post. You can shoot in 1080p and 2.7K at 60 frames per second, and shoot in 4K at 30 frames per second. You do get to change your aspect ratio on the camera, which doesn't really matter because again, that can be adjusted in post, but there is a grid layout that you can use to see your shots and how they'll be cropped. This mode does allow you to shift the view of the camera slightly, and it comes with the feature called Horizon Lock, which will keep your video leveled when the camera is leaned over to the side or even flipped upside down. There's also more field of view options like Max, which is an extra ultra wide view, and D-warp plus. And then exposure settings are the same as on single lens video. Me mode focuses the view on either the top or the bottom of the camera. Here you can record in 1080p and 2.7K with 120 frames per second and 4K at 30 frames per second. Landscape and portrait shooting is available with all the exposure settings except metering mode. Last but not least, single lens loop recording that shoots in 1080p, 2.7K and 4K at up to 60 frames per second. Again, you can set your loop duration, change your field of view and change exposure settings. And that brings us to the end of this video covering all the shooting modes available on the Insta360 X4. If you'd like to get your hands on one, visit 180by2.co.za. And if you found this video to be helpful, please give us a like and remember to subscribe so you don't miss out on future videos about 360 cameras and VR gear. Until next time, keep it real.